Lieutenant David Torres had seen a lot of strange things in 3 years of interstellar war, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of diplomats pretending to like each other. The observation deck of the Meridian's Hope had been transformed into what the brass called a reception venue, which apparently meant cramming 200 hostile representatives into a room with overpriced wine and hoping nobody started shooting. David stood near the viewport, one hand resting casually near his sidearm, watching Earth's diplomats smile with all their teeth while the ethery delegation smiled with none of theirs. "Try the canapes," Commander Sarah Okonkwo said, appearing at his elbow with a plate of something that might have been salmon once. "They're terrible, but watching Captain Henderson try to explain human cuisine to an alien species that evolved without umami receptors is the best entertainment I've had all week." David glanced across the room where Henderson was indeed gesturing enthusiastically at a platter while 3 ethery officials stared with the polite confusion of people watching someone explain poetry to a brick. "How long do you think before someone throws a punch?" "Optimistic. I'm taking bets on which delegation walks out first." Okonkwo popped something fried into her mouth and immediately regretted it. "Christ. Definitely the ethery. They have standards." The joke almost made David smile, which was something of an achievement given where he'd been 6 months ago. The Battle of Kepler 442 had left his unit with a 30% casualty rate and David with a recurring nightmare about explosive decompression. The promotion to the Meridian's Hope was supposed to be a reward, a nice cushy diplomatic posting where nothing exploded and everyone spoke in complete sentences. So far, the only explosion was whatever was happening to his taste buds from the wine. "Torres, you're not paid to be charming," Okonkwo said. "You're paid to look intimidating and make sure nobody smuggles antimatter past security. Try to look more intimidating. I'm doing my best impression of someone who cares about peace. Work on it." She drifted away toward a cluster of Earth Coalition officials who looked like they needed rescuing from a conversation about trade tariffs. David returned his attention to the viewport, where the Helix Nebula sprawled across the darkness like someone had spilled paint on velvet. 3 years ago, before the war, he would have found it beautiful. Now he mostly noticed it provided decent background lighting for spotting ships that shouldn't be there. That's when he saw her. She stood apart from the main ethery delegation, near the far curve of the viewport, and David's first thought was that someone had smuggled a warrior goddess onto the ship. His second thought was that thinking of warrior goddesses probably meant he'd been in space too long. His third thought abandoned him entirely because she turned slightly, and the light from the nebula caught her armor. It wasn't like anything in the Coalition's arsenal. Human combat gear was functional, modular, designed by committees who'd never been shot at. Her armor looked like someone had asked an artist to design protection for something too beautiful to risk. Intricate patterns flowed across its surface, not etched but somehow alive, shifting in colors that didn't quite exist in normal spectrum analysis. The breastplate curved with organic elegance, decorated with sweeping lines that might have been circuitry or might have been art or might have been both. Pauldrons rose from her shoulders like the wings of some predatory bird, and even from across the room, David could see the faint luminescence that suggested active technology woven through every centimeter. He realized he was staring. Professional security personnel did not stare at foreign dignitaries, especially foreign dignitaries from civilizations humanity was technically still shooting at in 6 different star systems. He tried to look elsewhere, but his eyes betrayed him, tracking back to her like a missile lock. She was tall, built like someone who'd spent years training for combat but moved with the grace of someone who'd spent years training for dance. Her features were striking in that uncanny way ethery always were, human enough to be familiar, alien enough to be arresting. High cheekbones, sharp jawline, skin that seemed to catch light differently than human skin did. And the ears, of course. Long and elegantly tapered, sweeping back from her head in graceful points that somehow made perfect aesthetic sense. Human genetic engineers had tried to replicate the look for decades and always failed, producing something that looked cartoonish rather than regal. Her hair was dark, pulled back in an intricate braid woven with metallic thread that probably served some tactical purpose he didn't understand. Everything about her suggested purpose, function married to form in a way that made coalition military designers weep into their standardization protocols. David forced himself to look away, focusing on a nearby champagne fountain that was probably violating at least 3 safety regulations. He counted to 10 in his head, running through mental exercises designed to help soldiers maintain focus under stress. When he looked back, she was watching him. Their eyes met across 30 meters of diplomatic theater, and David felt something in his chest do a maneuver that would have failed every flight safety test ever written. She didn't look away. Didn't pretend she hadn't noticed him noticing her. Instead, her lips curved into something that might have been amusement, and she tilted her head slightly in a gesture that transcended species. Then she started walking toward him. David's tactical training kicked in, running through scenarios. She was royalty. He'd seen the briefing files, recognized Princess Kalith Sarna from the intelligence reports. Approaching a coalition security officer meant either diplomatic overture or preliminary assassination. Given that she was crossing the room in full view of 200 witnesses, assassination seemed unlikely, but with the Aethery, you never knew. Their idea of diplomacy sometimes involved creative interpretations of personal space. She navigated through the crowd with the kind of casual authority that made people move without realizing they were moving. The armor's patterns shifted as she walked, colors flowing from deep blue to violet to something that looked like starlight condensed into metal. Up close, it was even more impressive, each plate fitting together with mechanical precision that somehow looked organic, breathing with her movements. "You like what you see, don't you?" she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. Her English carried an accent that made every syllable sound intentional, like she was tasting each word before releasing it. David's brain, which had survived 3 years of combat and countless tactical briefings, chose that moment to completely abandon ship. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again in a performance that would have embarrassed a suffocating fish. Every proper response fled. Every diplomatic phrase his training had drilled into him vanished into the void between his ears. She smiled, actually smiled, not the diplomatic grimace everyone else wore, and something about it made the armor pulse with warmer colors, golds and ambers chasing across the breastplate. Then, before David could assemble his scattered thoughts into anything resembling language, she turned and walked away, moving back toward her delegation with the same fluid grace. He stood there, still trying to remember how breathing worked, aware that his heart was doing something complicated and probably inadvisable. Somewhere behind him, he heard Okonkwo's voice cutting through his paralysis. "Torres, please tell me you did not just get flirted with by an alien princess." David discovered he still couldn't form words. His hand had moved from near his sidearm to hanging uselessly at his side. The observation deck continued its performance of diplomatic civility, but something had shifted, some variable had entered an equation he hadn't known he was solving. This summit, he realized with the clarity of someone watching a reactor heading toward critical, had just become significantly more complicated than anyone anticipated. David had spent the night convincing himself that Princess Kalith Sarna had simply been making polite conversation in whatever passed for ethery small talk. The fact that he'd woken up 3 times thinking about the way her armor had changed colors when she smiled was irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. He was a professional, and professionals did not obsess over alien dignitaries who could probably kill him 17 different ways before breakfast. "You look like you got hit by a plasma conduit," Lieutenant Jamie Chin said, shoving a cup of something that claimed to be coffee into his hands. They were standing in the engineering bay of the Meridian's Hope, surrounded by the comforting hum of machinery that kept 5,000 tons of spaceship from becoming a very expensive coffin. "Rough night? Couldn't sleep. Ship's temperature regulation is off again." "Aha. Nothing to do with you getting verbally demolished by royalty in front of half the diplomatic corps." David took a sip of the coffee and immediately regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. How does everyone know about that already? "Torres, we're on a ship. Gossip travels faster than light here. It's the one thing that violates causality." Jamie grinned, then pointed at a datapad. "Speaking of things that violate my understanding of physics, we're doing technical tours today. Guess who specifically requested you as a guide? The coffee cup stopped halfway to David's mouth. No. Oh yes. The E3 delegation wants to see our engineering systems, and Princess Calith personally asked for the lieutenant who looks so intimidating. Jamie made air quotes with entirely too much enthusiasm. Command approved it because apparently they think you have diplomatic potential, which suggests they've never actually met you. I can't do that. Assign Henderson. Or literally anyone else. Can't. Orders came from Commander Okonkwo, and she was very specific. Also, she told me to tell you that running away is not an option and she will personally throw you out an airlock if you try. Jamie clapped him on the shoulder. Look at it this way, maybe she just wants to steal our reactor designs. That's normal espionage. Very professional. 20 minutes later, David stood in the main corridor outside Engineering Bay 3, watching the E3 delegation approach like a man watching his own execution march toward him. Princess Calith walked at the center of the group, flanked by two advisors whose expressions suggested they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Her armor today was different, sleeker, more suited for technical environments. The patterns still flowed across its surface, but they'd taken on geometric precision, angles and lines that suggested circuitry. Lieutenant Torres, she said, and David noticed her advisors exchange a glance that spoke volumes about interspecies relations, none of them good. I understand you'll be explaining your propulsion systems. How fortunate. Your Highness. David managed something that might have been a bow or might have been a nervous twitch. Welcome to engineering. Please don't touch anything that glows, hums, or looks expensive. One of the advisors made a sound like a scandalized cat, but Calith laughed, actually laughed, and the armor rippled with bright blues. Is that standard coalition safety protocol, or are you improvising? Both. We have a lot of safety protocols. Mostly written after someone did something catastrophically stupid. He gestured toward the massive reactor chamber visible through reinforced viewports. This is our primary fusion reactor. It generates enough power to run the ship systems and propulsion, plus enough left over to make really impressive explosions if something goes wrong. Reassuring, Calith said, moving closer to the viewport. Her fingers traced along the glass, not quite touching. Your containment field looks unstable. There's a harmonic oscillation in the magnetic bottles, 3rd and 7th frequency. David blinked. He'd spent 4 years studying reactor engineering and another 3 maintaining them in combat conditions, and she'd spotted a problem their sensors had been arguing about for weeks in approximately 10 seconds. That's actually correct. How did you? Your readout display is visible in the reflection. She pointed at a console behind him. Also, the sound. Your reactor has a peculiar whine at that frequency range. E3 hearing is somewhat more acute than human. Of course it is, David muttered. Along with the superior technology, longer lifespan, and ability to look good in armor that would make a human look like a rejected robot prototype. Calith turned from the viewport, and something flickered across her face that might have been surprise. You think I look good in armor? David's brain caught up with his mouth approximately 3 seconds too late. Both advisors were now staring at him with expressions that suggested diplomatic incidents were imminent. He cleared his throat, desperately searching for professional footing. I meant, objectively speaking, E3 engineering aesthetics are superior to coalition design philosophy. Strictly from a technical standpoint. Strictly technical, Calith repeated, but her armor had shifted to warmer colors, ambers and golds chasing across the breastplate. And here I thought you were being honest. Honesty and I are not currently on speaking terms, Your Highness. Call me Calith. If we're going to discuss reactor harmonics, we should at least use first names. She moved past him toward the reactor control station, her advisors trailing with the resigned air of people watching a disaster unfold. Your magnetic containment is compensating for the oscillation by increasing field strength, which is creating thermal stress on the reactor housing. You're treating the symptom rather than the cause. David followed, trying to ignore how the engineering crew had suddenly found urgent tasks that required them to stand very close and listen very carefully. The diagnostic algorithms haven't identified the root cause. We've been running analysis for 3 weeks. Your algorithms are looking for mechanical failures. Kalitha's hands moved across the console with surprising familiarity, pulling up diagnostic screens. The problem is in your power distribution network. You're running secondary systems through the primary reactor feed, creating feedback loops. The oscillation is the system trying to balance loads that should never be on the same circuit. She pulled up a schematic that David had been staring at for weeks, and with a few quick gestures, highlighted power pathways he dismissed as irrelevant. The moment she showed him, it was obvious. Painfully obvious. The kind of obvious that would haunt him for months. That's actually brilliant, he admitted. And embarrassing. I should have caught that. You would have, eventually. Human engineering is quite impressive given your technological limitations. She glanced at him, and there was something playful in her expression. You improvise well. These reactors are held together with what I believe you call duct tape and prayers, yet they function reliably. There's elegance in that. Elegance is not usually a word associated with coalition engineering. Usually it's more like adequate or please don't explode. Function over form. There's honesty in that approach. Kalitha's fingers moved across the console again, this time accessing deeper system architecture. Though I notice you've added modifications that aren't in the original design specifications. This harmonic damper configuration, she highlighted a subsystem, this is your work. David felt heat rising in his face. How can you possibly know that? Because it's clever and slightly reckless, which seems to be your engineering philosophy. She turned to face him fully, close enough that he could see the faint technological patterns woven through her armor's surface, microscopic circuits that pulsed with gentle light. You increased reactor efficiency by 8%, but you're running 0.03% closer to containment failure than regulations allow. Brilliant and terrifying. That's the nicest criticism of my life choices I've ever received. Kalitha's armor shifted through a spectrum of colors, settling on something between amusement and interest. Lieutenant Torres, may I ask you something personal? The advisors looked ready to intervene, but she raised a hand slightly, stopping them. David found himself nodding before his tactical sense could object. Why did you join the military? You're clearly intelligent enough for civilian research. Why choose combat engineering? The question caught him off guard, cutting through the professional banter like a blade finding weakness in armor. David looked away, focusing on the reactor's steady glow through the viewport. Because civilian research requires funding, grants, political approval. In the military, someone just points at a problem and tells you to fix it before everyone dies. It's simpler. You prefer simplicity. I prefer purpose. Civilian life felt like. He searched for words, like floating in space without trajectory. At least here, even if the purpose is just keeping a reactor from exploding, it's something definite. Kalith was quiet for a moment, her armor's patterns slowing to gentle waves of deep blue. I understand that feeling more than you might expect. Before David could ask what she meant, Commander Okonkwo's voice crackled through his calm, Torres, we need you in security. Priority situation. Copy that. He looked at Kalith, suddenly reluctant to leave. I should go. Duty calls. But she reached into a compartment in her armor and produced something small, a device that looked like a crystal shaped into impossible angles. A communication node. Encrypted, private channel. In case you have something more interesting to say when your superiors aren't watching. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, and her armor blazed gold before she turned away, rejoining her advisors who looked deeply concerned about interspecies relations. David stood there, holding alien technology and wondering exactly when his simple security assignment had turned into something that felt dangerously like the beginning of everything. The communication node sat on David's desk like an unexploded ordnance, which, given that it was alien technology he absolutely should have turned over to intelligence, wasn't far from the truth. He'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, watching the way light refracted through its crystalline structure in patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. It's just a communication device, he told himself. Perfectly normal diplomatic exchange. People give each other communication devices all the time. The node pulsed once, a gentle amber glow, and a holographic interface materialized above it, text appearing in flawless English. People usually use communication devices for communicating. Novel concept, I know. David nearly fell out of his chair. He grabbed the node, thumbing what he hoped was an activation control. How long have you been listening? Approximately 19 minutes. Your internal monologue is fascinating. You've convinced yourself to contact me and talked yourself out of it 6 times. Kalitha's voice emerged from the node with crystalline clarity, carrying that accent that made English sound like music. I'm starting to think human decision-making is less linear than our xenopsychologists suggested. This is a security violation. I should report this to Commander Okonkwo. Probably. Are you going to? David looked at the node, at the gentle pulse of light that somehow seemed expectant. No. Good. I didn't give you encrypted alien technology just to have you immediately hand it to your intelligence services. They'd spend 6 months trying to decrypt it and miss the entire point. There was a pause, then her voice took on something warmer. I wanted to apologize for putting you in an awkward position earlier. My advisors informed me that direct personal contact with coalition personnel could be considered inappropriate. Your advisors sound fun at parties. Aetheri don't have parties. We have diplomatic cultural exchange functions, which are exactly as exciting as they sound. The node's light shifted through blues and greens. Though I suspect human parties aren't much better, based on that reception. Do you always serve food that tastes like punishment? David laughed despite himself, settling back in his chair. That was actually our good food. You should try military rations. They're scientifically designed to make you reconsider all your life choices. We have something similar. Nutrient paste optimized for long-duration missions. It tastes like regret and has the texture of. I don't actually have a human comparison. Perhaps sadness. Sadness paste. We should introduce our military suppliers. They'd either get along great or start a war worse than the one we're trying to end. The node pulsed with warmer colors, and David heard something that might have been a laugh. Lieutenant Torres. David. If you're going to mock my life choices over encrypted channels, we should use first names. David, then. Can I ask you something? That's usually how these conversations work. Earlier, when you talked about purpose, about preferring something definite even if it's just keeping a reactor from exploding. The node's light dimmed slightly. Did you mean that? David picked up the crystal, turning it over in his hands. Yeah. I grew up in Seattle Arcology, level 47. 30,000 people stacked on top of each other, everyone just existing, waiting for something that never comes. No frontiers left, no unknowns. Just comfortable, safe predictability. He paused, surprised at his own honesty. Then the war started, and suddenly there was something that needed doing. Something that mattered, even if mattering meant getting shot at. I studied xenobiology, Kalith said quietly. Spent 6 years at the Royal Academy learning about life in all its forms, dreaming about peaceful first contact with new species. Then humanity discovered slip space travel and came pouring into our territory like, what's that Earth animal? The one that's all teeth. Sharks. Sharks, yes. Humanity arrived like sharks, all momentum and appetite, and suddenly my peaceful career became military service. I went from cataloging microorganisms to learning how to kill efficiently. The node's light had gone cold, deep blues and purples. 3 years ago, I was excited about discovering a new form of crystalline bacteria. Now I command a battle group and wear armor that's killed 47 people. David felt something shift in his chest, some fundamental recalibration of perspective. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, most of us didn't want this war either. Just a lot of politicians and corporate interests who saw new territory and decided consequences were someone else's problem. Same with the E3. Our military council saw humanity as a threat to our expansion. Both our civilizations are very good at finding reasons to fight. She sighed, and the node translated it perfectly. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. We've barely spoken. Maybe because I'm the idiot who stared at your armor and then couldn't form complete sentences. Very disarming, strategically speaking. Your inability to lie is refreshing. Most diplomats I meet are so carefully dishonest it's exhausting. The node brightened again. Though for the record, you weren't just staring at the armor. I plead the fifth. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to assume it's an admission of guilt. David laughed, then checked his chronometer and swore. I have security rounds in 10 minutes. Commander Okonkwo will have my head if I'm late again. Then go. But David? The node pulsed once, warmly. Thank you for this. For talking like I'm a person instead of a diplomatic obstacle or enemy combatant. Same to you. For what it's worth, your armor really is remarkable. As is the person wearing it. He disconnected before he could say anything else catastrophically honest, but sat there for a moment, feeling like he just stepped off a ledge without checking if there was ground below. The node continued its gentle pulse, and David realized with absolute certainty that he was going to use it again, probably soon, definitely against his better judgment. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that probably violated several regulations and definitely violated David's common sense. He'd finish his security duties, return to his quarters, and find messages waiting in the node. Sometimes it was Caliph asking about human culture, genuinely curious about things like why humans found dogs emotionally significant or what jazz music was trying to accomplish. Sometimes it was David explaining Earth literature, discovering that she'd read more human philosophy than most humans he knew. She had opinions about Dostoevsky that would have started fights in university seminars. Crime and punishment is fundamentally about pride, Caliph insisted one night, her voice coming through the node while David lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. Raskolnikov doesn't suffer because he killed someone. He suffers because he can't live with being the person who would kill someone. It's ego death. I always read it as guilt. You know, normal I committed murder and feel bad about it, stuff. That's very human of you. To assume guilt is the natural response to wrongdoing. What would be the E3 response? Practical assessment. Did the action serve its purpose? If not, what can be learned? Guilt is inefficient. But her voice carried something uncertain. Though I'm beginning to think efficiency isn't everything. They talked about the war sometimes, dancing around the edges of classified information, but mostly about the absurdity of it. How both sides were fighting over territory neither really understood, how the coalition's expansion was driven by Earth's overcrowding and corporate greed, how the E3 military council saw humanity as barbarians who needed to be contained. Both agreed the whole thing was stupid, which didn't make it any less deadly. My brother died at Kepler 442, Caliph said one night, and the node went almost dark. He was a ship commander. 26 years old. Your forces targeted the bridge during an engagement. David felt his throat tighten. I was there. Lost half my unit when the E3 forces, breached our hull. 22 people, including my best friend. He was going to open a bar on Mars when the war ended. They were quiet for a long moment, the weight of mutual loss hanging between them like gravity. This is why they don't let us talk, Caliph finally said. Because then we become real to each other. Yeah. Much easier to shoot at abstractions. David, can I ask you something personal? You've been asking me personal things for 3 days now. Why stop? If we weren't on opposite sides of this war, if circumstances were different, would you have approached me? At the reception. David rolled onto his side, looking at the node. Honestly? Probably not. You're royalty and I'm a guy who fixes reactors. That's not exactly a fairy tale setup. Fairy tale? Story where the princess and the commoner live happily ever after. Very popular in human culture, statistically almost never happens in reality. Ethery have similar stories. They always end badly. The princess falls in love with someone inappropriate and it causes political disasters. The node pulsed gently. Though I'm beginning to think the storytellers might have had a point about inevitability. Before David could respond, his door chimed. Torres, you in there? Commander Okonkwo's voice, sharp and immediate. David practically threw the node into his desk drawer, hitting the disconnect so fast he nearly broke it. Yeah, coming. He opened the door to find Okonkwo looking grim. We've got a situation. Coalition outpost at Arcturus station just went dark. Last transmission said they were under attack. Ethery weapon signatures. David felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. When? 20 minutes ago. Emergency summit session in 1 hour. This could kill the peace talks entirely. She looked at him carefully. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine. Just tired. But he wasn't fine. Because 20 minutes ago, he'd been talking to Caliph about fairy tales and inevitability, and now people were dead and the fragile peace they'd been building was crumbling, and David had no idea, if she'd known, if this was all some elaborate intelligence-gathering operation, if anything they'd shared was real. The node in his drawer pulsed once, urgently, but David closed the drawer and followed Okonkwo toward whatever came next, feeling the weight of every word they'd exchanged and wondering if trust was just another casualty of war. The conference chamber had transformed from diplomatic theater into something closer to a gladiatorial arena, except instead of swords everyone wielded accusations. David stood against the back wall with other security personnel, watching humanity's finest diplomats attempt to outshout their ethery counterparts while maintaining the pretense of civilized discourse. The weapon signatures are conclusive, Ambassador Patricia Reinhardt was saying, her voice sharp enough to cut hull plating. Ethery plasma cannons, ethery ship configurations, ethery. Circumstantial evidence, interrupted High Chancellor Voron, his elongated ears lying flat against his head in what David had learned was the ethery equivalent of barely controlled rage. Anyone with basic technology could forge weapon signatures. This is a transparent attempt to sabotage negotiations. Transparent? Reinhardt's face had gone red. 73 people are dead. David's eyes found Caliph across the room. She stood with her delegation, armor locked in cold blues and grays, face carefully neutral. She hadn't looked at him once since entering the chamber. He wondered if she'd tried to contact him through the node, if she was wondering the same things he was wondering, if any of this mattered anymore. Lieutenant Torres. Commander Okonkwo's voice was barely a whisper. I need you to review the attack footage. Something's not adding up. She handed him a datapad, and David pulled up the security recordings from Arcturus station. The attack had been brutal and efficient, 3 ships dropping out of slip space, targeting the station's defenses with surgical precision, then disappearing before coalition reinforcements could respond. The weapon signatures were definitely ethery. The tactics were definitely ethery. Everything about it screamed ethery military operation. Except. David rewound the footage, watching the weapon's fire pattern again. Then again. Commander, these firing sequences are wrong. Wrong how? Ethery plasma cannons cycle at specific intervals based on their power coupling systems. It's a technical limitation of their energy distribution architecture. He zoomed in on the weapon discharge patterns. These are firing too fast. 0.3 seconds too fast, but consistently. Like someone programmed them without understanding the underlying physics. Okonkwo leaned in, studying the footage. Could be upgraded systems. Could be. Or could be someone faking E3 weapons without access to actual E3 technical specifications. David pulled up another angle, enhancing the image of one attacking ship. And look at the hull configuration. It's close to standard E3 military design, but the power distribution nodes are in the wrong positions. Off by maybe 2 meters. You wouldn't notice unless you'd spent time studying their engineering systems. Which David had, extensively, while lying in his bunk listening to Caliph explain the elegance of integrated armor power systems and how human engineering was charmingly primitive but occasionally inspired. Torres, are you telling me this might be a false flag? I'm telling you the technical evidence doesn't match what I know about E3 military technology. Which either means they've made significant upgrades without anyone noticing, or someone wants us to think this was an E3 attack. Okonkwo looked at the datapad, then at the conference chamber where both delegations were still trading accusations. I need to verify this with our technical analysts. But if you're right. She paused. Torres, how do you know this much about E3 weapon systems? David felt heat rising in his face. I've been studying their technology. Professional interest. Know your enemy, that whole thing. Aha. Okonkwo's expression suggested she knew exactly how much of that was bullshit, but she was choosing to ignore it for now. Don't go anywhere. I need you available if this escalates. She moved toward a cluster of coalition officials, and David found himself checking the conference chamber again. Caliph had shifted position slightly, and now she was looking directly at him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and even across the room he could see the question in her expression. Then one of her advisors said something urgent, and she turned away, but her armor had flickered through a sequence of colors that David was learning to read: confusion, concern, something that might have been fear. His comm buzzed. Private channel, text only, maintenance corridor 7B, 10 minutes. Come alone. K. Every protocol David had ever learned screamed that this was a terrible idea. Meeting secretly with an alien princess during a diplomatic crisis was roughly equivalent to juggling live grenades while standing in a fuel depot. Commander Okonkwo would have him court-martialed. Intelligence would have him imprisoned. Basic common sense would have him delete the message and pretend he'd never seen it. David checked the time and started calculating routes to maintenance corridor 7B. The corridor was one of the ship's arterial passages, usually bustling with engineering crews, but the crisis had pulled everyone to stations. David approached cautiously, one hand near his sidearm, acutely aware that this could be an ambush, a trap, or just catastrophically poor judgment. Caliph emerged from a side passage, and David's tactical assessment went out the airlock because she'd removed her helmet and her expression was something he'd never seen before: raw, unguarded, desperate. Did you know? They both said simultaneously. Despite everything, David almost laughed. I had nothing to do with the attack. I've been on this ship for 3 weeks. Same. I found out when you did. Caliph moved closer, keeping her voice low. But my military advisors are already calling for my delegation to withdraw. They're saying this proves humanity can't be trusted, that the peace talks were a mistake. Our side is saying the same thing about the E3. David pulled out his datapad. But I think someone wants both sides to think that. Look at this footage. He showed her the weapon discharge patterns, explaining the timing inconsistencies, the hull configuration errors. Caliph studied the data with the same intense focus she'd brought to the reactor analysis, and her armor shifted through analytical patterns, precise geometries in cool colors. You're right. These aren't our weapons. The power coupling is completely wrong. She pulled out her own device, some sleek E3 equivalent of a datapad. I can access our military database. If these ships were ours, there would be deployment records, tactical logs. That's classified information. You could be executed for sharing that with coalition personnel. So could you for meeting me here? She looked up from the device, and there was something fierce in her expression. I don't care about protocols anymore, David. If someone is sabotaging the peace talks, we need to know who and why. They worked in tense silence, Caliph accessing ethery military records while David cross-referenced coalition intelligence. The maintenance corridor felt increasingly claustrophobic, every sound of the ship's systems making David jump. They were both risking everything on the possibility that they could trust each other, that the conversations through the node had been real. There's no record of any ethery ships in that sector, Caliph said finally. Our closest battle group was 3 systems away. These weren't our forces. But someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like they were. David pulled up financial records, something he probably didn't have clearance for, but Okonkwo had given him access codes. There are coalition defense contractors who've been profiting from this war. Billions in revenue from weapons manufacturing, ship construction. Peace would destroy their business model. Same with certain ethery military suppliers. Caliph's armor had gone dark with anger. There are powerful interests on both sides who want this war to continue. They looked at each other, and David felt the weight of what they'd discovered settling between them. If we expose this, it could save the peace talks. Or it could make everything worse. Worse how? If elements of both our governments are involved, revealing it could trigger internal conflicts, coups, who knows what. Politics isn't exactly my area of expertise. Caliph reached out and grabbed his arm, her grip strong enough that he felt it through his uniform. David, 73 people died today. More will die tomorrow if we don't do something. I don't care about politics. I care about stopping this. Her armor was blazing now, fierce reds and oranges, colors David had never seen before. This close, he could feel the heat radiating from it, could see the technological patterns pulsing across the surface like a heartbeat. She was terrifying and beautiful and completely committed, and David realized with absolute clarity that he trusted her more than he trusted his own chain of command. Okay. We gather evidence, build a case that's airtight enough that both sides can't ignore it. He checked his chronometer. But we have maybe 3 hours before the delegations make formal decisions. After that, the political momentum might be irreversible. Then we work fast. Caliph started to turn away, then stopped. David, why are you helping me? You could report this, claim credit for uncovering ethery deception. It would make you a hero. Because I spent 3 days talking to you about everything from reactor harmonics to Russian literature, and you never once lied to me. That's worth more than being a hero. He met her eyes. Also because I really don't want to go back to a war where we're shooting at each other. Something shifted in her expression, armor colors softening to golds and warm ambers. When this is over, assuming we survive and don't get executed for treason, I'd like to continue those conversations. Maybe somewhere with less political complexity. Is there anywhere in the galaxy with less political complexity? Fair point. But I'd still like to try. Alarms started blaring throughout the ship, and David's comm exploded with emergency notifications. Okonkwo's voice cut through, all security personnel to stations. We have unauthorized access to classified systems. Lockdown protocols in effect. David and Caliph looked at each other, both understanding immediately. Someone knew they were digging, and someone was moving to stop them. The corridor suddenly felt less like a meeting place and more like a trap, and they were standing right in the center of it. The maintenance corridor's emergency lighting painted everything in angry red, and David's tactical brain was running through scenarios that all ended with court-martial or explosive decompression. We need to move. Now. Caliph was already accessing a wall panel, her fingers moving across the interface with practiced speed. The lockdown will seal main corridors in 30 seconds. Service tunnels are our only option. Service tunnels aren't designed for people. They're designed for maintenance drones and claustrophobia. Would you prefer explaining to your commander why you're here with me? She pulled the panel free, revealing a narrow passage that looked aggressively uninviting. Because I'm fairly certain that conversation ends with both of us in detention cells. David squeezed into the tunnel after her, immediately regretting every life choice that had led to crawling through ship infrastructure with stolen classified data while alarms screamed. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, lit by emergency strips that strobed in rhythm with his rising panic. Ahead, Caliph moved with surprising grace despite her armor, the patterns across its surface providing additional illumination. This was supposed to be a simple diplomatic posting, David muttered, army crawling around a coolant junction. Nice and boring. Maybe some light document reviewing. If you wanted boring, you shouldn't have stared at my armor. Calitha's voice carried back through the tunnel, and even now there was amusement in it. Also, you should know this tunnel connects to the ship's main data core. If we can access it directly, we can broadcast our evidence to both delegations simultaneously. They can't suppress it if everyone sees it at once. That's actually brilliant. Also completely insane and probably treason. I'm expanding your professional repertoire. They emerged into a larger junction chamber, one of the ship's neural centers where data streams converged. David could hear voices echoing through adjacent passages, security teams searching for whoever had triggered the breach alerts. He pulled out his data pad, bypassing several security protocols that were definitely going to get flagged. I can access the diplomatic channel from here, but we need both our authorization codes. They designed the system so neither side could hijack communications. He looked at Caliph. This is your last chance to walk away. Once we do this, there's no going back. Her armor blazed with fierce colors, reds and golds chasing across its surface. I stopped being able to walk away 3 days ago when you couldn't form complete sentences. Input the codes. David synchronized their devices, watching encryption layers peel back as they combined access. The evidence flowed into the broadcast system. Weapon analysis, financial records, communications between defense contractors on both sides coordinating to sabotage peace efforts. Everything they'd gathered, everything that proved the attack was a false flag designed to restart the war. Broadcasting in 5 seconds, David said. After this, we're either heroes or traitors. Possibly both. I can live with both. Caliph moved closer, close enough that her armor's heat was tangible. David, regardless of what happens next, thank you. For trusting me when you had every reason not to. Same. Though for the record, my reasons for trusting you were pretty questionable. Mostly based on you being really good at pointing out my engineering mistakes. That's adorable and tactically unsound. The broadcast went live, pumping their compiled evidence directly to every datapad, screen, and comm device in the diplomatic sections. David could imagine the chaos erupting in the conference chamber, both delegations suddenly confronted with proof that they'd been manipulated, that their own military-industrial complexes had orchestrated the attack to keep the war profitable. Security teams are converging on this location, Caliph said, checking her own tactical display. We have maybe 2 minutes before they breach this chamber. Any brilliant escape plans? Several. All terrible. She smiled, and her armor shifted to warmer colors. Though I should mention that my personal guard has been monitoring my location. They're loyal to me, not the military council. They should arrive approximately 30 seconds before your security forces. Should. That's not reassuring. I'm an optimist. The chamber's access hatch blew inward with a blast of pressurized air, and both coalition security and Aetheri guards poured through simultaneously, weapons raised, everyone shouting contradictory orders. David raised his hands slowly, watching Caliph do the same, both of them standing in the center of what was about to become a very unfortunate firefight. Stand down. Commander Okonkwo's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She emerged from the coalition side, data pad in hand, expression unreadable. Both sides, lower your weapons. Now. The Aetheri captain of Calipha's guard, a woman whose armor suggested she'd seen significant combat, stepped forward. The princess is under our protection. We're removing her from coalition custody. She's not in custody, Okonkwo said. Neither of them are. Though they are both idiots who just committed approximately 17 violations of protocol. She looked at David with an expression that promised lengthy conversations about career decisions. However, idiots who may have just saved the peace talks. Ambassador Reinhardt appeared behind Okonkwo, looking like someone who'd aged 5 years in the past hour. The evidence you broadcast is being verified now. Financial forensics teams are tracking the money flows. If this is accurate. It's accurate, Caliph said, her voice carrying royal authority that made everyone pay attention. Members of both our governments have been profiting from this war. They orchestrated the attack to prevent peace. The question is what we do about it. High Chancellor Voron pushed through the Aetheri guards, his expression furious. You accessed classified military databases. Shared restricted information with coalition personnel. This is treason, Princess. Yes. It is. Caliph didn't flinch. And I'd do it again. 73 people died today because someone wanted to protect their profit margins. I won't apologize for exposing that. The chamber fell silent, everyone processing the implications. David watched the faces around them, seeing the calculations happening in real time. They'd forced both sides into a corner, either acknowledge the conspiracy and deal with internal corruption, or suppress the evidence and prove the conspirators right about prioritizing politics over peace. There will be investigations, Reinhardt said finally. On both sides. Arrests. Probably some very public trials. She looked at David and Caliph. You two just created a massive political crisis. Better than a massive actual war, David said. Okonkwo made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a suppressed scream. Torres, you're confined to quarters pending official inquiry. No communications, no unauthorized movements, no more creative interpretations of security protocols. Understood, Commander. The Aetheri captain moved to escort Caliph away, but she turned back, catching David's eyes across the chamber. Her armor flared gold, just for a moment, and there was something in her expression that made all the probable court-martials feel worth it. 2 weeks later, David stood in the observation lounge where this entire mess had started, watching the Helix Nebula paint light across darkness. The investigations were ongoing, several high-ranking officials on both sides had resigned or been arrested, and the peace talks had resumed with new delegations who actually seemed interested in peace rather than profit. He'd been cleared of major charges, technically what he'd done was legal, just catastrophically inadvisable. Okonkwo had recommended him for commendation and psychiatric evaluation, possibly in that order. The Aetheri delegation was preparing to depart, heading back to their homeworld to help implement the preliminary peace accords. I thought I might find you here. Caliph's voice, and David turned to see her standing in the entrance, armor gone, wearing simple civilian clothes that made her look less like a warrior princess and more like someone he might have met in normal circumstances. Her ears still swept back elegantly, marking her as Aetheri, but everything else looked startlingly human. Figured I'd enjoy the view before they ship me off to some remote outpost where I can't cause international incidents. David gestured at the nebula. How did the political fallout go? About as well as committing treason usually goes. I've been formally censured, stripped of some ceremonial titles, and assigned to the permanent peace delegation. She moved to stand beside him at the viewport. Apparently making myself useful is my punishment. That doesn't sound too terrible. It's not. Mostly because the permanent delegation is stationed here, on the Meridian's Hope, for the next year at least. She looked at him, and even without the armor her expression carried that same directness. Which means I'll be around. If you're interested in continuing those conversations we started. David felt something in his chest that might have been hope or might have been terror or might have been both. About reactor harmonics and Russian literature. Among other things. Though I should warn you, my diplomatic schedule is complicated, there will be intense scrutiny of any personal relationships, and approximately half of both our governments think we're dangerous radicals who can't be trusted. Is this your way of asking me out? Ethery, don't ask out. We state intentions clearly and negotiate terms. But she was smiling, and her ears had shifted to an angle that suggested amusement. Though I'm willing to try human courtship customs. They seem unnecessarily complicated but statistically effective. Most human customs are unnecessarily complicated. We excel at making simple things difficult. Caliph reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and real. David, I spent 3 years fighting a war I didn't believe in, killing people I had no quarrel with, watching friends die for political calculations. These past few weeks, talking to you, working with you, believing that peace was possible, that's the first time I've felt like myself since this all started. Same. I signed up looking for purpose and found mostly death and broken reactors. Then you walked up and asked if I liked what I saw, and suddenly everything got significantly more complicated and significantly more worthwhile. That's probably the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I'm an engineer. Romance isn't my specialty. Neither is diplomacy, apparently, but you managed to end a war. I think you're selling yourself short. She squeezed his hand gently. So. Do you want to see where this goes? Knowing it will be difficult and probably inadvisable and definitely watched by intelligence services on both sides. David looked at her, at this alien woman who'd somehow become the most human person he'd met, who trusted him enough to commit treason, who made reactor harmonics sound like poetry. He thought about purpose, about the difference between existing and actually living, about the fact that the universe had somehow brought them together despite every rational reason they should have remained enemies. Yeah, he said. I really do. She kissed him then, there in the observation lounge with the Helix Nebula as witness, and it felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected but both of them had been looking for. Somewhere in the ship, alarms would eventually sound, protocols would be violated, and both their careers would face more scrutiny. But for now, in the space between war and peace, two people who'd learned to trust each other decided that maybe the universe's most unlikely outcomes were sometimes its best ones. Outside, the nebula continued its slow spin through infinity, indifferent and magnificent, lighting the way forward for a ship full of former enemies learning to become something better.